and Susan's kids, not just Dennis and Kathy's kids. They're like our kids. I know you're not a kid anymore, Jessica, but you were. You grew up in this church, and so I love that. And I love that because that's the way this church looks at our kids. I also think it's true because we have like these awesome kids. Like if you were here last Sunday, then you heard Paige and TJ share a sermon on Youth Sunday, and you heard several of our kids lead worship in the most beautiful, genuine, and wonderful way. If you weren't here, you should check it out on YouTube because it's a great sermon. Anyway, we have wonderful kids. Well, today we're going to hear from one of those young kids who is now a young woman who spent this last year in New Orleans in the Presbyterian Mission Program as a young adult volunteer, and you helped her get there with your gifts and with your prayers. And so, Jessica, we just want you to know that we are thrilled that you're back, so thrilled that we have cake. But we also have been, sort of keeping tabs on you from afar and keeping you in our prayers. And we're grateful for what you've done. We're grateful for the people you've encountered, and we're grateful that you've come today to tell us about it. So, welcome home.
Well, hello to all of you. I have missed this place. It looks very different. I was walking up like, wait, what? What has happened? But it looks beautiful, and so do all of you. So thank you for having me today so I can talk to you a little bit about my last year and what it's been like and what I've learned. Just in case you don't know or didn't get from what Greg said, I was doing a service year in New Orleans, Louisiana, with the Presbyterian Church. So they have a mission program for 19 to 29-year-olds. They do a lot of worldwide mission, but this is a really cool program, and they have 22 sites throughout the United States and the whole world where they send us, and we just work alongside people who are already in the community doing work. So it's just kind of about joining in and seeing what we have going on. But to start, I'm going to read a scripture, which is the foundational scripture of the whole mission program. So it's from the book of Isaiah, chapter 58, verses 6 through 12. So, is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you, the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. And then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to live in. The word of the Lord. So, my year in New Orleans was beyond anything that I could have expected. It was filled with more joy and more sorrow, more laughter, more grief than I could have understood a year ago. I guess I should say it. There are pictures playing. They're just random pictures from my year. They don't actually correlate to what I'm saying. They're just pictures of where I worked, my housemates, and the people that I served with. But I left San Diego last year with a desire to be a part of something greater and more permanent than what I called a Band-Aid fix. And to this day, I can't really pinpoint what I was searching for, but I can tell you what I found. I found that I was welcomed, but not expected. I was wanted, but not needed. And that the best way to not be a part of a Band-Aid fix was to stop trying to fix things, but rather to be present, to listen, and to build genuine relationships. You see, New Orleans is a city that needs help. And unfortunately, it is a city that will always need help. There are still houses that need to be rebuilt from Hurricane Katrina, which devastated the city 13 years ago. And there are houses that were rebuilt after that storm that flooded again last August. You see, service is a mix between doing and being. The things that I did will wash away. The things I built and painted will deteriorate over time or when the next storm comes. But the stories that I heard, the voices that were raised, and the love that was exchanged, that will all remain when the flood waters rise again. I wasn't in New Orleans to fix things, but I was there to bear witness to my friends in that city. I was there to see and acknowledge their oppression, their grief, and their struggles. But I was also there to witness their joy, their laughter, and their perseverance. I was in New Orleans to cry, but I was also there to dance. You see, no one does sorrow and celebration quite like New Orleans. It isn't uncommon for a funeral to last for hours, with people falling out in the streets. That's the way they say passing out. They fall out. They'll be like, I fell out yesterday, and it was just, you're like, okay, I get it. But every funeral ends with a second line, the most joyous of celebrations, celebrating a life well lived and the gift of life given to those who remain. I've never heard more joyous music than that of a brass band at a second line. There's music and dancing through the streets. And let's put it this way, if you don't want your car danced on, never park on a funeral route. But grief isn't just found in death, and celebration can be more subtle than second lines and Mardi Gras. It's in your morning prayers. It's in kids dancing in the rain, and my friend from the garden, Cream, screaming the Lord's Prayer at the top of his lungs, but beginning every line with, I don't need no prayer. This idea of being present in both sorrow and in celebration is what tied my whole year together. In New Orleans, I had 3 very separate but very interconnected communities. They say that New Orleans is the biggest small town. But I had 2 work sites. The first was the Ochre Abbey, which was a community giving garden in an underserved and economically impoverished area. It served as a center for spiritual recreation and recreation. I also worked at Jefferson Presbyterian Church, which is a small congregation with a huge heart for mission. Imagine 15 people in a worship service, and they run a food bank, so there's 15 people, and they run a food bank for 261 clients. I also had my housemates, which were 6 unique, amazing, and challenging individuals, and we lived together and we served together. So each one of these communities shaped me, my perspectives, and how I encountered sorrow and celebration this year. I was a jack of all trades this year, and I loved it. For me, every day was busy and constantly changing. I was a part of so many different ministries that my work communities grew to include more people than I could have imagined last August. I could list to you everything I did this year, all of the ministries and what my days looked like, but we would literally be here for hours. So in short, I was sent to Jefferson to run their food bank and their tutoring center, but I was also the closest thing they had to a full-time staff member, so I also went on hospital visits and planned the Sunday morning worship services. At the Abbey, I did things from gardening to grocery shopping, cooking a meal for 50-plus people. I wrote love letters, and I delivered fresh grown produce to homebound members of the community. But I probably put in the most hours at home, building what they call an intentional Christian community. Now, some of those hours were filled with fun, learning to trust each other and the city we lived in, but also some of those hours were filled with fights, working through tough things, and learning to not just live with each other, but how to live for one another, to give and receive love without condition, to study and grow in faith and knowledge together. It seems that my housemates pushed me in a way that I've never been pushed before, to be better than I ever thought possible. They pushed me through conflict, vulnerability, laughter, and tears, but I grew because I knew that they had my back. I learned this year that service work is not anything you can do as an individual. You need relationships, you need support, and you need people to drive you to keep going when it would be easier to quit. When I was home at Christmas, I shared with you all some stories that captured a few aspects of my year. And so I'm going to do the same thing now, because I think the people I served speak louder than I can. But I need to warn you that not all of these stories wrap up with a nice bow. The ending isn't figured out, and it isn't always hopeful. But that is why I think that they are stories that need to be told. They are bigger than me, and it is not my job to figure out why they matter. But these are the stories that made me smile, they made me cry, and they're the stories that I'm still confused about. T.S. Eliot has a quote, "You are the music while the music lasts." Well, these are the stories that are the music that I danced to this year. In all honesty, at the beginning of this year, I really struggled with the food bank. It was chaos. 2 hours and 261 clients. I could not find the humanity in it. Yes, we were giving out food, but I wanted to know these people. In November, I started running check-in, so I sat at a table in the entryway and asked people for their names, found them on a list, and had them sign in a box. It seems simple, but it was so loud in that food bank room. I could never hear people's names, and on top of that, Cajun names never sound the way they're spelled. So this came to a head one day when it was raining, so all of our clients are cold, wet, and impatient, and our volunteers were not in the greatest of moods either. I was cussed out 18 times in 1 hour, just for not being able to hear someone's name. But I was honestly near tears after the things one man had said, when there was this huge commotion on the other side of the room. Everyone, from clients to volunteers, they were yelling at this old woman walking in the back door. She looked so frightened and confused, and people just kept yelling at her, like, "What are you doing? You have to come in this way." Like, "No, you're doing it wrong." And she just like wasn't registering anything. And at that point, I was just so over the noise that I got up and I walked over to her, and I realized she was speaking Spanish. Now, I don't speak Cajun, but I do speak Spanish. So I quickly told all the other volunteers, like, "You need to stop yelling at her. It's not helping. She has no idea what you're saying." And I started walking her through the process, got her in the right lines, helped her fill out her paperwork, and I never went back to the check-in table. So there's just a line of people standing, waiting to be checked in. So when I finally got her in the right spot, I went back assuming everyone was going to start yelling at me because I just had left them. And instead, they got scraps of paper, and they started writing their names down on the paper because they knew that I couldn't understand their names. They knew I didn't know how to spell the Cajun names. And they had just seen humanity. So this old woman, her name is Miss Ada Cuevas, She gave me the introduction to humanity at the food bank. So for the next 2 months, the amount of time it took me to memorize 261 names, everyone walked in and handed me a paper with their name written on it. And with the yelling and the confusion gone, I got to get to know them, to ask questions about their weeks, their moms, their kids. And they all know that when Miss Ada Cuevas walks into the room, I get up from the check-in table, I take her through the food bank setup, and then I come back and help the rest of them. And something about that interaction, a few words spoken in Spanish, some names written on paper, the food bank went from a ministry that I dreaded to one of my favorite days of the week. This next story is the story that I cannot quite make sense of. It's the one that I can't figure out the ending to. And it isn't pretty, and there is no white bow for this. You see, New Orleans has a gun violence problem. As of today, 100 people have been killed in New Orleans in 2018. To put this in perspective, from the data available, 18 people have been murdered in San Diego. In February, New Orleans' count was already at 40. For the first 2 months of the year, someone died at the hand of a gun almost every day. And when I say people, I mean black men. On Martin Luther King Day, Gerald Poole was fatally shot directly in front of the garden where I work. It turns out that I didn't know Poole nor the man who shot him. But in May, when there was another fatal shooting in the exact same spot, I knew I wouldn't be so lucky. As it turns out, I knew both the man who was killed and the man who was involved in the shooting. Jarvis Jarrow was shot at 8:50 a.m. on a Thursday morning while he was taking his kids to school. We didn't know Jarvis well because he had just gotten back into town, but we know his brother Swole. He's been up on the screens. He's the one painting the rocks. Swole used to help us out in the garden, and he painted all of our rocks for our Ebenezer. You know, the rocks you stack to signify God's presence along your journey. Well, now those vibrant rocks rest 20 yards from where that black bag sat for hours. After the shooting, Swole would stand on the corner grieving by crumping. It's this kind of mesmerizing dance. It's not choreographed. It's just raw emotion being pulled out through the body. His movements would throw him into the walls of the corner store and onto the ground, and you could hear him crying and screaming. His grief was raw, and it was exposed. It was there for everyone to see and feel and heal. But time changes things, though, and 3 weeks ago, Swole and his mom walked into the garden and asked for a watermelon. They sat down and had some coffee with us. And the day after we gave them a watermelon, it was in the paper. Ronald was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The same Ronald who came into the garden 3 times a day for coffee. The same Ronald who insisted on praying for us every morning. Beautiful, thoughtful prayers. The same Ronald who just wasn't really able to understand life or what was really going on. The same Ronald who had told us he was a murderer, but had also said so many other off-the-wall things that you never really knew what was true. The same Ronald whom I considered my friend. So how do you put a bow on that? I wanted to avoid a Band-Aid fix, and I got my wish because how do you fix this? How do you put an ending on one friend ending the life of another? How do you dance to that music? The honest answer is that I don't know, because I still love Ronald, and I still love Swole, and I love that he can ask for a watermelon. To me, this is the first part of the march after a funeral, when the brass band plays a mournful, slow song, like Nearer, My God, to Thee. But after the dirge, the band picks up, and they begin to play When the Saints Go Marching In. So let me tell you about Troy. because where Ronald is my sorrow, Troy is my celebration. We first met Troy the day after he was released from prison. He was not doing well. His steps dragged, and he couldn't keep his eyes open. His hands were so swollen, and he walked by keeping them in front of him, extended from his body. He came into the garden and immediately fell asleep on a bench. My coworker, Kat, was convinced that he wasn't breathing. So we walked over to try to find signs of life. And he was breathing, but as we leaned over him, we saw his hands. He had wounds in the center of each palm, grotesquely infected wounds. He needed a hospital. And a few hours later, when we woke up, we asked if we could drive him or we could find someone to drive him to the hospital. He said no, that he just wanted to wash his hands. So Kat held a garden hose over his hands while he rubbed his wounds. For 30 minutes, water streamed over his hands as he tried to wash the pus away. It was one of the most disgusting yet humbling experiences I've ever had. They tell you to find Christ in everyone, but a man broken and beaten with holes in his hands? Taking care of the least of these, taking care of Jesus, it has never, ever been more clear. Well, Troy always came back. He would stop in for coffee on his way to take care of business, find his ID, do whatever he needed to do. He would come in and check in with Kat and I, make sure we were doing all right. Some of his days were great, and some of his days were pretty terrible. He had accidentally fallen asleep, something he would do a lot mid-sentence on most days, and someone had stolen his bag with his newly acquired ID and birth certificate. It's pretty common that when people come out of prison, they don't have access to any of their previous documentation, and they can't get help. They can't go to a food bank. They can't go to a homeless shelter. They can't do anything without an ID. So while he was down that day, because his newly acquired stuff had just been stolen, the next day he was waiting in line to get new ones. His drive was rare. There are people that we serve every day at the garden who have been in the process of getting their IDs for over 3 years now. And Troy has his again. The more we got to know Troy, the more he trusted us, the more his beautiful personality came out. One of my favorite days with Troy was on Easter, which was when my family was visiting. We had a catfish grill out. And it had been pretty hot and dry the week before, and so our winter crops were finally starting to die out. But Troy was not okay with this, and he decided that we needed to have a funeral for the dead plants. He read scripture while I was washing dishes, and he talked about how much the flowers had added to the garden, what an amazing and prosperous life they had lived, adding so much to the lives of others. And so he decided to have a funeral, and he then proceeded to scold Kat and I for letting the plants die. We were now the murderers of plants. But a second line it was time for. So he found white napkins, and he passed them out to the people in the garden, and he started a beat, and he started dancing around and around the garden, singing, dancing, waving his white napkin in the air. And people started to join him. And so he termed all his second-liners the Catfish Steppers. We celebrated the life well-lived of our precious winter crops with the joy of the Catfish Steppers, led by Troy. But Troy's contagious spirit doesn't end there. He is the one who gave me my street name, Indiana. You see, Kat and I cooked a meal every Wednesday, but I always made the dessert. And Troy loved my banana pudding. He also loved my bread pudding and my brownies, whatever. But he said that my banana pudding was so good that there was no way I could be from California. He insisted that I baked like I was from Indiana. Hence the name. I was pretty well known in the neighborhood where I worked, but not much beyond the borders of Pigeon Town. But by the end of the year, Indiana's banana pudding was known in 3 different hoods. People would pop in and ask for it on random days. It'd be like a Monday. They'd be like, "You got Indiana's banana pudding?" And be like, "We serve a meal on Wednesday." Like, it might be there, I don't know. But I have now been charged with opening a restaurant called Indiana's, and I'm only supposed to serve banana pudding. But one day in June, Troy disappeared. Now, this happens a lot, and we have no way of knowing where our friends have gone. They could have gone to visit a relative, to the hospital, or to prison. Well, everyone kept telling us that Troy was upstate, which means that Troy was at Angola, the max security prison farther north than New Orleans. And we were devastated because Troy had been doing so well. But maybe 3 days later, after we had finally become convinced that, okay, he's upstate, Kat and I were driving to a church by our house, and we saw him, 30 minutes away from Pigeon Town, working at a car wash run by the Baptist Seminary. Both Kat and I were happy screaming in the car. We pulled over, jumped out, and we're like, "Troy!" And he was like, "Indiana, Little Red." Like, everyone was very confused. But it was such a joyous moment because Troy has a job and an apartment in a new neighborhood far away from the life he used to live. And I can only hope that Indiana's banana pudding is famous in Gentilly now, too. So that is what I have for all of you today. Thank you for listening to me, and if you have any questions or want to get coffee or anything, I'd love to hang out with any and all of you. So.